English translation. 606th contact. Saturday, the 3rd of January 2015, 14:25 hours.
Here you come, Ta. Just got to the office. But that is a good thing, because there are a lot of things to discuss. But be welcomed and greeted.
Greetings to you too, Edward.
After our correction work, Bernadette told me that in Canada the group there praises the English edition of The Might of the Thoughts in their shop, which I have to buy from Australia and send on. I don't think that's okay, because our order says something else, namely that the books can only be sold worldwide from the center.
What you say is correct because everything has indeed been laid down, but as Florina told you, we have decided today in the committee on the matters that you want clarified. During my last visit, you explained to me that the rules we had in place for the worldwide sale of books, publications and materials from the Mother Center were very cumbersome, costly, and labor-intensive, and that Eva was very burdened as a result. We have set the rules in the context of an anticipatory avoidance with regard to the globalization of the marketing of books, writings, and materials so that free trade is not created by dealers and publishers, etc., who are not related to the FIGU and act only for the sake of profit. According to your explanations during my last visit, and also according to what you asked Florina to do to inform me, we in the committee have come to the conclusion that we have to withdraw our earlier order and regulate the whole thing through a new resolution. What you now say about the Canada shop, this action is not correct according to the old regulation, but this regulation is now to be abolished and replaced by a new one and made feasible. From now on, everything will be handled within the framework of the following 7 points, thus also avoiding a purposeless globalization. 1. For FIGU national groups. If corresponding contracts exist with you as author or later with the association FIGU Mother Center, Hinterschmidruti, 1225, 8495 Schmidruti, Switzerland, FIGU books and FIGU writings are to be translated into the corresponding national languages. FIGU national groups are not entitled to enter into third-party contracts for translations and the printing and distribution of FIGU books and FIGU writings in favor of other FIGU groupings or with external publishers, nor with other interested parties. This means that there is no right of disposal for the transfer of printing rights, etc., to publishers or private individuals in one's own country or in other countries. 2. Contracts concluded in relation to the translation. Printing and distribution of FIGU books and FIGU publications made by you or the FIGU Mother Center shall apply exclusively to the national groups listed in the contracts. 3. It applies that each FIGU national group, which translates its own FIGU books into its own languages and publishes them in print, shall also independently sell them worldwide. This means that the books have to be bought by you or later by the FIGU Mother Center in order to sell them worldwide from the Mother Center. In the future, all related activities, shipping and distribution in a worldwide form, will be carried out by the individual FIGU national groups. 4. All FIGU national groups can financially acquire books and writings translated into their national language from other FIGU national groups and also resell them worldwide. The financial matters relating to purchase and dispatch are to be regulated under the individual FIGU national groups themselves. 5. All FIGU national groups in all countries can advertise, distribute, and therefore also sell all existing titles or books in all translated languages in their shops. 6. To what extent FIGU national groups shall transfer their own translated and printed FIGU national groups in other countries to FIGU national groups purchasing FIGU books by granting a percentage to the FIGU national groups in other countries shall be clarified between the two parties themselves. 7. FIGU national groups are entitled to sell their FIGU books and FIGU writings also via bookstores. as well as to individuals if they exercise a bookstore function, whereby 40% discount of the sales value is to be granted for resale.
Thank you, that's for sure. But how about it now, if there is no FIGU national group or other FIGU groups in a country, but individuals are interested in translating our FIGU books and FIGU publications into their national language and possibly printing and selling them? I asked you this question via Florina.
In this respect, too, we have taken a decision in the committee to the effect that such interests must be taken into account. With the same framework of the 7 points being valid as I have just mentioned, but everything must always be regulated correctly in writing.
That too is now clear. Then I have a question regarding FIGU candidates. I also asked you this question about Florina.
That is correct. And we have also discussed this in detail in the committee and found that the whole behavior should be maintained in the same way as it has been handled by the FIGU Association for good reasons. Core group candidates must stay at the center at least once a month for 2 years before a core group application can be made, work there, and get to know the core group members and the mission operation. If possible, the first Saturday of the month should apply for this time. The performance of work for the FIGU mission outside the center cannot and must not be included in the 2-year period. Because this does not open up any contact with the core group members, nor is there any direct involvement in the FIGU and mission work.
So it cannot be accepted that if someone, she or he, is interested in core group membership, simply does work for FIGU at home or elsewhere for 2 years in order to join the KG.
This is correct, because in this way, neither a direct and important contact in the mother center with the effective and manifold mission work and cooperation with the core group members comes about, nor a personal getting to know and togetherness in relation to the core group members. Also, the behavior patterns prescribed by the teachings remain unrecognized in the core group, so it is difficult to accept them, and it is not possible to insert oneself into them. The requirement requires that the direct internal contact with the mission work takes place, as well as the direct and continuous contact with all core group members is inevitable. This is the only way to develop a sense of community and behavior.
That's the way it's been since the beginning. And we did good with that, too.
That's the way it is.
Well, I thank you and the board for the clarifications. Then I have a question about the Ebola, which we talked about at the 598th official conversation, and about the fact that this epidemic was caused by bats, flying foxes, and monkeys. Now, I have read in a small article in a newspaper that only the bats, but not flying foxes, are the originators of the epidemic.
This is not true because we have tried to clarify the situation thoroughly and found that although bats carry the Ebola virus, there are also some flying foxes and certain species of monkeys. If something else is claimed, then it does not correspond to the truth.
Recently, I have been asked again and again about the prophecies and predictions, especially with regard to the movement that will work for complete nonviolence. Achim Wolf has written the following.
Prediction regarding movement for total nonviolence fulfilled.
In the 251st contact of the 3rd of February 1995, sentence 197 states, "The first steps have already been taken for a new movement which will work for complete nonviolence, while another grouping is formed through which a woman will attain a great and powerful world power." The whole prediction may seem quite harmless at first glance. If the two parts are considered more intensively and connected with each other under the aspect of nonviolence and the mentioned grouping and woman, then their far-reaching meaning for the world becomes only clearly recognizable. The first part of this prediction, confirmed by Billy Edward Albert Meier, is the so-called non-violence movement. Founded by the Swedish painter and sculptor Carl Fredrik Reuterswärd, the marketing professional Rolf Skjoldebrand, and the manager Jan Hellman, and registered in 1993 in Banyas, Valais, Switzerland. It can be found on the Internet. In Germany, there is with the Forum Bayreuth ohne Gewalt, an organization which is committed to the idea of the song Imagine by John Lennon and the Knotted Gun by Karl Friedrich Reuterswärd. See Knotted Revolver below. It can be reached on the Internet. According to the non-profitable movement, it wants to inspire young people to solve conflicts without the use of violence or to prevent the use of violence. An example for the work of the movement from the last-mentioned Internet page, Violence Prevention Days, in cooperation between the Forum Bayreuth Without Violence, the Federal Police Bundespolizei, D, and the Institute for Sports Science at the University of Bayreuth, Uni Bayreuth. D, the educational concept Violence Prevention Days, Together We Are Strong, Bayreuth ohne Gewalt. D, for schools in the city and the Bayreuth region. Peace education focuses on self-esteem and community. In 2013, these days were held for the first time with children of the Herzogehochschule. http www versus the nonviolence movement aims to reach and inspire as many young people as possible in schools and sports clubs worldwide. According to the organization, 6 million young people, teachers and sports teachers all over the world, have already been trained according to this philosophy of violence prevention. The symbol of the movement is the above-mentioned revolver with knotted barrel. Thus, once again, Billy Edward Albert Meyer's prediction has been confirmed. Also, Yoko Ono, the widow of the musician John Lennon, who was murdered in 1980 and ex-Beatles, promotes the organization as a member. Complete nonviolence. This idea sounds like peace, harmony, and love at first hearing. However, viewed closer or in the light of truth, it is not assertive in the long run because absolute nonviolence in its one-sided form is not capable of survival. The idea of total nonviolence and the idea that life is possible without any use of logically necessary force is tantamount to a hostile ideology that is incompatible with the laws of nature and life, on which all becoming, life, and decay are based, and is always directed towards the balanced interplay of the poles of positive and negative. In order to make life in positive balance possible at all, the two poles, negative and positive, must always be in a balanced, harmonious balance of forces, whereby a healthy balance of forces or a viable harmony is produced, which fits into the unshakable principles of the laws of nature. As soon as the balance overflows in one direction or the other and threatens to upset the balance of power becomes positive or negative, leading to the destruction of life forms, peace, freedom, harmony, love, etc. In the wild, for example, a wild beast that threatens to extinguish and destroy all other life must be rendered harmless and killed, since it endangers the life and survival of other animal species and people living there. For the natural protection and life support of the other, not degenerate life forms, the snatching beast must therefore be rendered harmless. Because it beats out of the natural species and threatens to take all life with it into the abyss, which blends harmoniously into the law of nature and must therefore be protected. The killing of the life-threatening beast is thus an act of emergency for the protection and preservation of all dignified life, whereby the killing in itself is a negative act, but in this case it serves a positive, good purpose, and thus corresponds to a positively balanced act of emergency. If, on the other hand, the species of humans become beasts and commit serious crimes, such as the fighters of the IS murderer and butcher gangs, they should nevertheless not be maltreated in the same way as they do to their victims, but should be sent to completely inaccessible places and without any possibility of escape, for example in the south of Patagonia, left to their own devices for life and exile. Nor should they ever be given the opportunity to return to society again, because degenerate, dehumanized fanatic beasts cannot be treated. In spite of all the horrors, even the worst crimes do not justify the killing of the delinquents, which in turn would amount to murder. These people are also part of the evolution of their consciousness and must be allowed to learn from their misdeeds, even if it seems hopeless. The work of the unmistakable, life-giving creational laws and recommendations is directed toward love, but not toward revenge and retaliation, even if some vengeance and retaliation cries do not make this fact clear. A complete and unconditional nonviolence, however, is never feasible and not compatible with the laws of life, but sooner or later inevitably leads to doom. Through unconditional nonviolence, a way of life, a group, a society, a people, a humanity, etc., becomes incapable of fighting itself and offers no resistance to an aggressive attacker, which is tantamount to a cowardly and stupid act of self-destruction, or an act of non-intentional throwing away of one's own life. There is then a positive degeneration, through which a life form defenselessly exposes itself to every attack and thus evokes its downfall itself. In a sense, life is always a struggle, at least as far as the preservation of one's own livelihoods is concerned, including adequate defense against attacks of all kinds. A logical nonviolence, on the other hand, stands for a kind of passive violence that is carried out actively or violently, but without physical violence, but only in the sense of passive resistance without any bloodshed, torture or terror, etc. This logical force is an appropriate means to change adverse circumstances or to remove incompetent leaders of peoples and states from office, whereby through a determined unity, inflexibility and clarity of purpose of the people of a people, everything can be achieved without loss of human life that must be done to establish a real democracy or to create a real peace. Dictators, incompetent governments and despots can only become great and powerful, gain power over the people, and continue their misanthropic actions if the people of the people allow this through their passivity, cowardice, and fear, and surrender their responsibility without will. Moreover, a vague notion of general nonviolence is not enough to change undemocratic conditions, replace errant leaders, and bring about peace. In addition to the consensus of the people already mentioned, this requires above all a clear goal about what is to be achieved and which means are effective. If, for example, a true democracy is to be achieved in this way, each individual person of the people must also take full responsibility for it, and must clearly and unambiguously see to it that the goal of a true democracy is achieved, and must stand up for what should then be striven for with all available peaceful means and achieved to the end. This, however, not with brute force, coercion, war and bloodshed, but with iron unity and determination in the exercise of a passive resistance which forces the irresponsible in power to give up their position and their power and to hand over the full determination over all concerns to the people. This requires a lot of time, patience, and perseverance on the part of people who are truly democratically oriented. Quote from Billy Edward Albert Meier's Richness of Nonviolence and Deep Spiritual Explanations, the 7th of November 2012. The teaching of the Spirit. The teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, teaches with special emphasis love, compassion, peace, knowledge, wisdom, joy, happiness, freedom, and harmony. The teaching offers a great wealth of thoughts and feelings and also teaches nonviolence and all unique and at the same time lasting means to attain life security. All people can benefit from this teaching, learn and experience that true love and compassion are the essential cornerstones in which the whole building of behavior in life is founded. It is taught that hurting, destroying, and destroying life is of complete deviance and contrary to all creational natural laws and recommendations. To inflict suffering or pain on a human being or any other living being in malevolence and without the need for self-defense or to harm him or her in any way is not only to be avoided under all circumstances, but also against the entire creative and natural laws and recommendations. This applies to all forms of life, from the highest to the lowest, from the most consciously developed human being to the lowest insect and bacterium. Even the life of the lowest bacterium can only be fought if it is necessary, for example in the case of diseases. Even the lowest bacterium has a life purpose and is part of the overall evolution of all life and all things, so it can only be fought when it is necessary. The creational natural laws and recommendations teach that suffering, pain or harm should not be inflicted on any being, but that everything should be directed in such a way that peaceful coexistence can exist. Joachim Wolff, Germany.
So this prediction is just as true as the one that refers to the new grouping with the woman who will attain a world power position. The new grouping refers to the EU dictatorship, which has turned into a world power, because that is what this dictatorship really has done, and the woman who will gain a world power position in this grouping is the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. Joachim Wolff has also written another article about this, the following.
Prediction regarding strong world power of a woman fulfilled.
In the 251st contact from the 3rd of February 1995, sentence 197, it says, "The first steps have already been taken for a new movement which will work for total nonviolence, while another grouping is formed through which a woman will attain a great and powerful world power." The second part of this prediction, this was also confirmed by Billy Edward Albert Meier, is about the European Union and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who holds an almost monopolistic position of power within the EU dictatorship in the style of an unofficial president. Strictly speaking, she is the dictator-in-chief of this forced merger of various European states, in which the EU Commission has the official say, but in reality, the individual powers of the most important member states, first and foremost Germany, followed by France and other states, which, however, in terms of significance and power, have already fallen considerably behind the German ruler Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel has apparently already increased herself into a mania for power and determination in the service of the former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl at the time of her allegiance. which only allows her own striving for power and her own confused ideas of a European order to be regarded as decisive. According to Angela Merkel, the rest of Europe, and if it were up to her egoistic, power-obsessed, and fanatical megalomania, the rest of the world would presumably submit unconditionally to this striving for power. This is demonstrated by the fact that This is confirmed by the living conditions of many German citizens who have to suffer under the inhuman Hartz-IV laws, who have to work like slaves or like front workers for a starvation wage, or even without remuneration, and have just enough money left over that it is too little to live, but too much to die. The measures taken to reduce global CO2 emissions are also purely alibi exercises that resemble a drop on a hot stone that goes up in smoke. Not to mention the root of many evils on our planet, namely the worldwide overpopulation, which is to blame for countless catastrophes, grievances, and inhumanities, but which continues to be ignored and hushed up by the powerful of this world out of pure egoism and out of criminal indifference and irresponsibility. In all this, there is no real sense of responsibility in the character of Mrs. Merkel. On the contrary, it seems, when one sees her talking and closely observes her gestures and facial expressions, that all her promises, assurances, and speeches consist only of lies and the threshing of empty straw, with which she wants to sell the stupid citizens of her country and those who listen to her and believe her stupidly according to all the rules of acting. In reality, she cares nothing at all about the welfare of the people of her own country or about the welfare of the citizens of Europe. Otherwise, she would behave quite differently, namely uprightly, openly, responsibly, and honestly, as only Helmut Schmidt did among her predecessors. Among the successors of Helmut Schmidt, who has a strong character, there is unfortunately not much substance left in the sense of the ideal image of a good statesman or a good stateswoman. It has even become much worse. For all the powerful statesmen of the formerly free states who submitted themselves to the EU dictatorship betrayed and sold their own fatherland along with their freedom, their independence, and their traditions, and this only out of pure greed for power and profit, through which these powerful states made themselves unscrupulous and cunning crooks and swindlers of the people of their own peoples. The summit of audacity and brainwashing megalomania by Angela Merkel and her associates is the arrogant interference in the affairs of Russia and Switzerland, once a good friend and neighbor of Germany, but now to be intimidated by violent threats and sanctions, cornered and demonized as a personified enemy of the rest of Europe. Vladimir Putin is certainly not a peace-loving little sheep driven by the ideal of charity, just as he is not a flawless Democrat, as his friend, the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, once called him. But in contrast to the EU dictatorship monkeys, who are truly wolves in sheep's clothing, Putin stands behind his country and defends, albeit not out of unselfish motives, his Russian fatherland, which both the EU as well as NATO and the USA want to push against the wall and probably be rebuilt. Completely in the spirit of the late U.S. President Ronald Reagan as the realm of evil to an enemy image. Truly a diabolical game of the EU dictatorship superiors, who, however, in their delusion, in their megalomania, and in their boundless greed for power and expansion, do not really know what they are doing or what they are doing. What they are still able to do with their criminal behavior. For this could be a new world war. once again instigated by pure megalomania and blind greed for power, as it happened not so long ago by a degenerate, powerful man in Germany, who fell victim to a sick delusion and wanted to take over the whole world by force. The result was the Third World War, with many millions dead, incredible destruction, and a new world power order, which still determines our world today. The fact that Mrs. Merkel has always turned her flag according to the wind of power and continues to do so has already been proven by her behavior during the Second Iraq War, when in July 2006 she invited the then U.S. President and warmonger George W. Bush to her home, and together with him prepared and ate wild boar on a stick, courting him in a slimy manner and making herself his will-less and dogged vassal. She had an equally friendly relationship with the former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, with whom she had an almost intimate love affair, although in reality all such leaders are, of course, one-sided lovers for power that binds this kind of person together. Unfortunately, all this does not promise anything good for the future of the state of Germany and the countries of Europe and Switzerland, because Mrs. Merkel, by her way of a mixture of crawl and unscrupulous instinct for power, manages in an unfathomable way for many people to cast a spell over all the authorities, women and men of the EU dictatorship, and to make them dance like a Pied Pipers according to her whistle. It costs the people whatever it wants. For Angela Merkel apparently cares about these a damp filth, which all people can clearly recognize. The alert mind their motives, their behavior, and their actions and deeds pursue and see through. It remains to be hoped that Angela Merkel will reflect on what has been said and will take a neutral stance in order to prevent evil consequences for Europe and humanity. Achim Wolff, Germany.
Well, prophecies say that in later times women would rule the world and act more humanely, rule and deal with people differently than men have done over the millennia. But that really is still far-fetched music of the future, for it will not be so quickly, and consequently, centuries will pass over the world before it is time for women to seize power and, in the aforementioned humane way, lead the destiny of mankind on Earth. Until that is the case, the whole thing will come about, as it has always been proven for millennia, namely that when people who are harassed and oppressed, and then freed from it, also exert the whole harassment and oppression on their fellow human beings. This is also evident today in families, companies, corporations, and governments, where women are now in charge through the so-called consequences of emancipation, and take leadership and power into their hands. Various of these women, precisely those who now want to exercise leadership positions and power, as men have done since time immemorial, now make use of their strength gained through the female freedom movement and strike back and live out what has been done to them themselves in tribulation, bondage, and oppression. There are examples of this everywhere where today women are in charge and come to power. It often seems as if they want to take revenge on the men for the oppression they have suffered for thousands of years, and thus demand retaliation in the way that they, for their part, now impose bondage and oppression and harsh demands and enact laws, rules, and decrees by which the people suffer and are forced into a corner defenselessly. But this must not be misunderstood, because in this respect I am only talking about the kind of women who actually live out their degenerations in this way. So there is no question of those who correctly adapt to and behave in accordance with the change in equal rights between men and women, etc. And it is precisely in this regard that I believe that the majority of women who liberate themselves from affectation and oppression behave sensibly and live equality and equal rights between men and women within the right framework. So I'm not talking about the so-called emancipations that I spoke about earlier and that sit over the man as a result of the emancipation movement. Equality and equal rights between men and women must be based effectively on the fact that both sexes move uniformly in all their tasks and rights, and that, consequently, one sex does not take precedence over the other. There must be equal obligations and equal rights between women and men, including equal pay for work. And that equality and equal rights between men and women really work is something we experience every day in the FIGU, because this principle corresponds to our attitude and we behave accordingly. So we only have the coexistence of women and men, without one side rising above the other, and consequently equality and equal rights are lived out and peace reigns.
A fact that is truly remarkable. When I look at the opposite unpleasantness which I make with regard to the terrestrial people in my observations in families, friendships and acquaintances, as well as in places of work, in small and large enterprises, as well as in offices and in politics, etc., then this corresponds to a very rare circumstance with regard to how the whole of equality and equal rights between the female and male sex is cultivated in your association.
It corresponds to the mission.
Of course.
But what I have failed to say about those domineering women who find the way to take leadership and power in any way is that they are much meaner, more sneaky, more perfidious, and more ruthless than men in equal positions. And if they get out of hand in the process, then they also know no pardon and go over corpses, as is the case with men. And this is in complete contrast to the fact that the woman is different, more sensitive, more human, and more tolerant than the man in every respect. But as I see it, those women who fall under the image of domination and power addiction are tough, ruthless, and obsessed with success in the business world as well as in the family, in friendships and acquaintances, and are superior to many men in this respect. Many also display this behavior when they can free themselves from oppression and then oppress and dominate others themselves. So they then transfer the oppression they have suffered through the men's world to others, namely to women, men, and children, which unfortunately then leads to women being generally and uniformly insulted as degenerate by the women's and men's world. Of course, the wrong and degenerate action of oppressing people is cheap and completely wrong, no matter if it is done by women or men, because for oppressing people there is never a right, because either way it means despotism, subjugation, and enslavement. And what has to be said about that is that my explanation cannot be interpreted in any way in such a way that men are better than women, because they too are subject to the same actions and actions as women do when they are freed from a grip or oppression. In addition, many men also disfigure themselves in many ways when they attain leadership and power positions. But all this can only change for the better if people in general, men and women, turn to the creational laws and recommendations, learn and follow them, and thereby learn and comprehend modesty and humanity. Only then, when this is done, everything can become good and loving as well as peaceful and harmonious, and the humans of Earth become truly human.
Your words in the ear of Earth humans, but it will be questionable whether they act accordingly.
I am also aware of this, because many Earth humans usually think only for themselves, and only outwardly up to the tip of their noses, which is why their thoughts and feelings are usually selfishly shaped and only wander around in their consciousness in this way, and therefore bring neither true success nor benefit. They lead their lives in an endless lamentation or exclusively in the exercise of power, gain and profit as well as amusement addiction, and complain about their fellow human beings and the trouble of living. They do not see the goodness and beauty of life and do not know how to devote themselves to love, peace, freedom, and harmony, because they are simply not interested in it, but only in their own deceitful behavior. So they also cannot recognize, grasp, and comprehend the values of life, because their hunt for the unreal in every relationship leaves them no thought for the reality of life and its truth and values. Thus they wander on completely wrong paths through existence and waste time and their whole life with useless things, without ever being able to come to a green branch and say, "Now at last I have found life and its meaning."
Unfortunately, this is really the case, because the majority of people on Earth behave unrealistically in their way of life, and in their actions and rules, and do things that cause them enormous damage. As is the case with the IS and all those who behave in some way racist, xenophobic, and hostile to religion.
That is an undeniable fact that always brings degeneracy. When I think of those morbidly stupid and stupid people who adhere to the fundamentalist Islamist state and even sacrifice their lives for it, while still murdering, massacring, torturing, and raping, then horror can creep in. Equally stupid, however, are all those who fool Islam, the Muslims and its prophet Muhammad, into death and viciously insult them by abusive speeches, primitive comics, caricatures and abusive articles, etc., as for example comedians, caricaturists and satirists with little understanding and little reason do, as does the French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo. The whole action of comedians, caricaturists and satirists has nothing to do with the right of comedians to be allowed to allow themselves anything. Consequently, they cannot allow themselves to violate the ethics, decency, and honor and dignity of a human being, an association, a religion, a true prophet or believer. Comedy, caricature, and satire correspond to so-called artistic genres, which are characterized by exaggeration and exaggerated, mocking criticism or mockery, but have nothing to do with maliciously and discriminately violating the high moral values, decency, honor, and dignity of people in the deep private sphere, as well as believers of any faith or their prophets, etc. When Kurt Tucholsky formulated his legendary sentence in 1919, "What can satire do?" Everything. He probably did not think that one day exactly this everything would lead to deeply violating the ethics or the moral high values, the decency, the honor, and dignity of people, as well as their faith and fundamental beliefs. This was certainly not his intention. Nor was it his intention that sectarian and terrorist, bloody and murderous machinations would ultimately emerge from this everything, and that many human lives would be lost. But if this is nevertheless done in such a way that satire has an injurious effect, so that murder, manslaughter, and destruction result from it, especially in the deeply private sphere of man, to which also his faith and his faith values belong, then this has nothing more to do with satire and nothing more with mockery, etc., but with malicious and terror-like insult and injury. Nor does it have anything to do with reasonable and appropriate criticism, nor with righteous freedom of expression and freedom of the press. It is fact and correct and must also be allowed that religions and religious faith, as well as the founders of religions, may be pulled through cocoa in a critical or funny way by comedy, caricature, and satire. But on the one hand, everything has to correspond to the effective truth and nothing but the truth. But on the other hand, the righteous attitude of man or woman has to be the basis for the truth. Must be preserved for believers, and must refrain from malicious insults, lies, abuses, slander, and moral violations. The framework of concern, ethics, honor, and dignity must be preserved and must not be violated. When a so-called comedy, criticism, caricature, or satire goes below the belt, or malicious lies and slander are brought into the world with it, then on the one hand this must not happen, and on the other hand such machinations testify to the cheap, and the author is not responsible for the bad character, injustice, irresponsibility, and depravity of the so-called comedians, critics, caricaturists, and satirists concerned. And if this happens, then under certain circumstances a xenophobia and racial hatred will also appear, as well as a contempt of man and disregard for all high values of ethics, decency, honor, and dignity, whereby those who do these things prove their miserable and characterless behavior, with which they in their stupidity pillory themselves, but which they do not realize in their ignorance and unreasonableness. So they also don't notice that they build up hostilities through their lousy and dirty machinations, and are no longer sure of their lives under certain circumstances. And this is also the case when they find followers for their wicked and unjustified attacks, lies, and slander, who cheer them, shout for and cheer for them and defend them. But it is to be noted that these cheers and shouting for their character and behavior must be ill in the same framework as the authors of the primitive graffiti, words, caricatures, and satirical speeches by which their followers are incited. What is offered today in malicious, greasy, and slanderous comedy, criticism, caricature, and satire regarding Islam, Muslims, and their prophet Muhammad is disgusting and wrong. Facts concerning religion and its founders and prophets are not spoken about openly and honestly in an appropriate and correct manner, which also does not clarify the effective facts, but maliciously falsifies and denigrates them by lies, hijacking, and slander, as well as by blasphemy in speech, word, and caricature. But that is not yet enough of evil, because through the whole also the faith and the dignity of men are stamped into the mud, who belong to the corresponding religion and who honor its founder and prophet. Exactly this is done nowadays by right-wing radicals, by certain xenophobes, religious and racial haters, as well as by irresponsible so-called comedians, caricaturists, and satirists, who attack, abuse, and mutilate Islam and Muslims in particular. But that has nothing more to do with comedy, fun, and satire, even if the comedians and satirists refer to the degenerated Islamism, which they want to denounce, whose fanatical and radicalized delusions it is, who indulge and murder and destroy their terrorism worldwide. And these delusional, sectarian, fanatical, and radicalized elements are the ones who take revenge on the naive comedians, caricaturists, and satirists, and murder them without hesitation in a true bloodlust and destroy everything good imaginable. The comedians, caricaturists, and satirists are so naive that they do not recognize the great danger they create when they insult and attack religion, the faithful and their prophet, as in the case of Islam, Muslims, and Muhammad. But it is not the intellectually and rationally righteous Muslims who therefore react with hatred, revenge, and retaliation to the caricaturistic and satirical abuses, but it is the degenerated, fanatical, and radicalized Islamists who react with murder, suicide attacks, massacres, and mass murders, etc., who degenerate into humanity. Thus, these degenerated elements also bring righteous Muslims into disrepute and promote hatred against them and Islam in general. The degenerated and humanly degenerate Islamists, however, have nothing to do with the Islam religion, nor with the righteous believing Muslims, who basically keep themselves away from violence and discord and reject any fanaticism and radicalism in faith, and consequently any terrorism. These believing Muslims are people who want to represent love, peace, freedom, and harmony, and also want to live in this way. They are righteous people like all other righteous people of all faiths, be they Buddhists, Jews, Christians, Hindus, or members of Asian, traditional, or new religions. But this is not understood by Christians in particular, why they wrongly condemn Islam and Muslims and connect them with the degenerated, fanatical, and radicalized Islamists, who are lying about their murder and destruction in the name of religion, faith, and the Prophet, and bring unspeakable suffering to countless people. And it has to be said that comedy, caricature, and satire, which in any way are insulting and murderous to a person or to the believers of any religion, in this case Islam, Muslims, and their prophets, have nothing more to do with effective comedy and satire. Comedy, caricature, and satire in a good and correct and irreproachable setting can be interpreted in a fundamentally amusing way, and do not in any way appear insulting, slanderous, or murderous, so that they are not taken as offensive by the believers of a religion. On the other hand, caricatures and comic and satirical presentations in pictures, writing, words, and drawings may and can denounce everything in relation to fraud, theft, war, lies, robbery, strife, injustice, terrorism, crime and slander, and the like in an absolutely offensive, evil, blatant, and violent manner, because this is a completely different case, because in this way even malicious comedy, caricature, and satirics cannot be hard and sharp enough to show the evils. But also here it is true that only the effective truth may be brought to bear, and that decency, ethics, honor, and dignity must be preserved in every way. With regard to the private pages of people and religions, etc., comics, cartoons, and satire must always be kept in such a way that, on the one hand, they must correspond to the effective truth, and, on the other hand, they must also be funny, but not insulting, etc. So good comedy, caricature, and satire are in no way objectionable unless they are in some way insulting, denigrating, murderous, lying, and slanderous, especially in relation to faith and the matters of faith to which honor and dignity are given by the believers. Many caricaturists, comedians and satirists, as well as xenophobes and racial haters, who in this way are nothing more and nothing less than unscrupulous extremists and provocateurs, who in their own way also engage in terrorism and thus dangerously incite people to enmity, which can lead to evil and fatal consequences, violate the very principle of the rule of law. With their fanatical and radical hostility to anything they don't like, they shoot their poisonous arrows and spur their enemies into rage. These then resort to revenge and retaliation, for they are those who have fallen into a fundamental sectarian fanaticism and radicalism with regard to a delusion of faith, just like the degenerate and humanly degenerate Islamists who have nothing in common with the real Islam. The makers of dubious and hateful comedy, cartoons, and satire against Islam, the Muslims and their prophet Muhammad, are of the opinion that they should allow themselves anything with impunity. That with their irresponsibility in this respect they themselves act terroristically and thus promote the desire for revenge and the decadence of the decadent Islamists. So far, these naive and irrational mad comedians, caricaturists, and satirists, as well as xenophobes and racial haters, cannot think. They take shameless liberties and blaspheme believers and their prophets, and thereby effectively engage in dangerous terrorism themselves. But they also do so without hesitation or thoughtlessness with regard to the deep privacy of people, for they have no respect for that either. For such an act, the ordinary citizen is punished if he freely and openly speaks or writes his opinion and the truth regarding criminal machinations of sectarian and other fraudsters, thieves, liars, and slanderers, etc., because then he is drawn before the jurisdiction, as happened to me several times. If, however, journalists in newspapers, radio and television, as well as dubious and irresponsible comedians, caricaturists and satirists blaspheme a religion and believers and their prophets in terms of images, drawings, words, blaspheme, insult, and denigrate, then they can do so unscathed because the majority of the population and the rulers cry out pro for it and hurrah. And the population and the rulers do this because they are not pregnant with reason and cannot recognize the effective facts that are given in reality. They simply follow with the wolves howling when they start howling. Unfortunately, stupidity with regard to the majority of people on Earth is sown just as much as the possibilities of mass influence by a few irresponsible people, who can sweep the masses along with falsehoods and injustices as well as with discord and violence, etc. Consequently, they then roar and behave in the same tone as the irresponsible ringleaders. And that this is the case is proven by the history of mankind since time immemorial, such as the Nazi system of the First World War and the neo-Nazi system that exists today, the PEGIDA in Germany, the IS and the IS, the Islamist state in Syria and Iraq, and the criminal organizations around the world, headed by all the howling and irresponsible and inhuman models who walk over corpses and gather stupid and like-minded people and spread murder, terror, oppression, and all conceivable misery and evil. In the process, these crying people, those who are the howlers of the wolves, be they xenophobes or racial haters, irresponsible comedians, caricaturists or satirists, are not aware in their stupidity that they see discord and hatred in what they do and that they resemble what already happened during the Nazi era. There can be no talk of good and healthy as well as funny comedy, caricature, and satire, but only of abuse and of effective multi-layered image, word, drawing, and speech terror. This is precisely the case when a religion and its believers as well as its founders and prophet are insulted and blasphemed in image, scripture, word, and drawing. In this reprehensible way, the whole thing is built no more and no less than on a riot of journalists, comics, cartoons, and satire terror, and this cries out for revenge and retaliation against fanatical and radicalized elements, whereby here especially murderous and terrorist Islamists are meant, against whom also the righteous believing Muslims refuse and thus distance themselves from the murderous rabble. So behind Islamist terrorism is not an Islamic background but a bloodthirsty Islamist background. This also makes the difference clear that a righteous Islamic believer is a genuine Muslim, while an Islamist is an unrighteous, fundamentalist, fanatical, radical, and murder-mad terrorist and not a genuine Muslim. It is interesting to know that the hate comedy, caricature, and satirics about and against Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and the believing Muslims are carried out exclusively by so-called Christian people, while such practices, which are directed in the same way against the Christian world, its believers and Jesus Christ, are almost completely absent among Muslims. But what those who call themselves Christian men take out, and in this relationship oppose Islam, its believers and Muhammad and those of other faiths, is in fact the strongest ground in every barrel and is brought about by irresponsible people, who do not give a damn about the fact that it provokes and promotes revenge and retaliation, from which again murder, manslaughter, and destruction arise. Suicide bombers are summoned to the plan, and terror and mass murders are perpetrated. But it also shows the traditional Christian religious hatred against Islam, and thus also the miserable attitude against everything and everything that does not fit into the stuff of countless Christians who are just as extreme and irresponsible as the Christian Church has been since time immemorial, whereby as an example only the Crusaders and the Inquisition have to be thought of once. The guilty comedians, cartoonists, and satirists of today believe that they can afford anything and insult other people with impunity and violate their honor and dignity without being called to account. And indeed, they have become so impudent today that they violate the beliefs of religious believers in the worst possible way, and with impunity from the authorities, especially with regard to Islam and Muslims. And then they call the whole thing freedom of opinion and freedom of the press, although everything is nothing more and nothing less than nothing more and nothing less than an evil agitation against Islam and the Muslims and a persecution of them, and equals the old-known Nazi methods concerning the persecution of the Jews, the neo-Nazis and other extremists. Xenophobes, racial and religious haters send their greetings. The fallible comedians, caricaturists and satirists, and we are only talking about these fallible ones, take self-proclaimed and false liberties and insult the faithful, which has nothing to do with free freedom of opinion and freedom of the press, but with journalistically sanctioned or legitimated image, script, word, and drawing terrorism. But this will be avenged, especially in cases where the founders of religion, prophets, faith, and the faithful are insulted and denigrated by false and malicious comics, caricatures, and satirics, as is the case with Islam, Muslims, and their prophet Muhammad. So it will be, as it has already happened, that caricaturists, comedians, and satirists of this form, by whom the prophet Muhammad and thus also the believing Muslims are insulted and murdered, will be killed again and again by Islamist fanatical, radicalized and vengeful murderers, suicide bombers, and killer commandos, who in their wrong sense live in the delusion that they have a right to murderous revenge and retaliation. So it is not surprising that sooner or later there will be new attacks against comedians, caricaturists, and satirists who are hostile to Islam, Muslims, and Muslims. I am surprised that not very much has happened in this respect yet, and that so far the makers of the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo, as well as the Swiss satirist Andreas Thiel and also other Islamophobes and Muslim hostiles, have not yet got into the revenge machinery of the humanly completely decadent Islamists or other fundamental Islamist fanatics. It is to be feared, however, that this will happen sooner or later, because the fanatical, radicalized, and crazed Islamists have no understanding for the degenerate Islam, Muslim and Muslim hostile machinations of every kind of the naive comedians, caricaturists and satirists, as well as the xenophobes and racial haters who curse and demonstrate against Islam and the Muslims, like for example the followers of the PEGIDA movement in Germany. On the contrary, they are even more challenged to hatred and bloody revenge and retaliation by the idiocy of the inappropriate Islamophobic, Muslimophobic, and Muslim comedy, caricature, and satiric. And this is exactly what is currently happening in Germany, because this path of provocation, which causes hatred, revenge, and retaliation among the Islamists, is also being followed by the mass association PEGIDA, or Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, which was founded by a criminal, xenophobic, racial, Islamic, and Muslim hater. The following can be found about him on the internet.
Lutz Bachmann **. the 26th of January 1973 in Dresden, is a German political activist. He is regarded as the initiator and organizer of the xenophobic association, Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident, PEGIDA, which was founded in October 2014. Bachmann was born in Dresden in 1973 as the son of a butcher. He attended the Leonhard Frank Polytechnic High School in Coswig and the Arthur Becker Children's and Youth Sports School in Dresden. After graduating from high school, he trained as a chef and founded an advertising agency in 1992. Bachmann has been convicted of numerous crimes, assault, burglary, and theft, and was sentenced to 3 years and 8 months imprisonment in 1998. Shortly after the conviction, however, he evaded justice and fled to South Africa, where he lived under a false name for 2 years, but was finally identified by the immigration authorities and deported to Germany. After 2 years in prison in Germany, he was released prematurely on parole. In 2008, he was found with 40 grams of cocaine and another 54 grams narcotic offenses. The following prison sentence has been suspended and expires in February 2015.
What brews up with this PEGIDA has a devilish resemblance to what happened when the Nazis in Germany began to form and then to Brights. What was directed against the Jews at that time is now directed against Islam, and thus against the Muslims. So the Nazi system once again sends its greetings, this time in the form of hatred against Islam and the Muslims, although it is to be feared that the whole thing will again spread to the Jews through the influence of the neo-Nazis and other extremists, and that against it the government of Germany and the responsible persons of the police as well as the other safety organs do not undertake anything, which do not dissolve PEGIDA in the germ, and also do not pull the criminal and racist ringleader from the traffic and make him harmless by a separation from the society. That is absolutely incomprehensible.
What you have said about the terrorist activities of the Islamists, who belong to different groups worldwide and who will take revenge on those naive comedians, caricaturists and satirists who insult and denigrate Islam. The believers in Islam and the Prophet Muhammad through their words and drawings, such events will inevitably take place, precisely that mad Islamists will strike and commit revenge and revenge murders. It may be today or tomorrow, in the near or distant future. Over and over again, if it is not stopped, insulting Islam, the Prophet Muhammad and the faithful through inappropriate comedy, caricature, and satire, and through hostile speeches and demonstrations. And when it happens then, in the long run, the whole thing will not remain one single event, but the whole thing will continue to spread and still bring much suffering. And what you said about the mass movement PEGIDA, I see and understand in the same way as you do. What happened with regard to the Nazi system began in about the same style when the people in Germany were criminally incited against the Jews and declared to be inhumane. And if now the mass movement of the PEGIDA is not stopped, then something can develop from it, which in the end shows the same traits as the persecution of the Jews, whereby, of course, another framework can be given and the whole thing degenerates into a popular Islam and Muslim hatred, whereby a disaster threatens which can no longer be controlled.
That is also clear to me, and if I can come to talk about it again, there is also the catastrophe with the IS or Islamist State, which has been going on for so long now. In this respect, nothing is being done by the so-called international community, not even in the Syrian civil war, which has now been going on for 4 years, and also in relation to the Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and so on and so forth. To stop all the killing and misery and all the destruction, torture, and rape of women and children. The responsible rulers only sit magnanimously in their upholstered armchairs and have a good time with fine food and wine, because they themselves live in complete safety. And if they already decide something, then it is not they who have to go to the front to hold their heads up, but the military who send them off and get death and destruction. The leaders of the governments are only making big noise, the leaders of the so-called international community, which is truly not one, because all the states and their powers work only for themselves and do not join forces with others in a useful way, as would be necessary, for example, for a multinational peacekeeping force according to Henoch's system. For if this were to exist, there would long have been a lasting peace all over Earth and among all peoples, because such an organization would have brought about this peace and would also preserve it. But neither do the rulers of all states, because they have less power, no longer want to wage wars, nor can they determine everything at their own whim and for the sake of their profits, as the arms industry does not want to, because it could no longer supply weapons, etc. to war zones or armies. And as far as the criminal IS or Islamist State is concerned, it has to be said that all those bloodthirsty elements, which are trained by the IS and sent back home again, are nothing else than sleepers, that is, creatures, which are fanaticized and radicalized by the IS and which are only sent back to their homeland to wait for the time there, in order to perform murder and destroy their learned murderous handicraft in a disastrous and terrorist way. The governments and authorities responsible in the home countries, as well as the security organs, secret services and military forces, do not seem to perceive this danger, however, but to sleep, because how else would it be that stupid speeches are made by authorities, etc., and claims are made that the returnees are purified from their Islamist fundamentalism, fanaticism, radicalism, and delusion, and are now repentant. Perhaps this may be exceptional in one case or another, but the majority of those returning home certainly do not fall under such exceptions, if such exceptions exist at all. So terrorism is not prevented, but promoted, precisely in that IS-trained elements can reappear in the home country and exist as sleepers, in order to strike murderously when the appropriate opportunity arises, if they are given the order to do so, or if they are simply given the opportunity to do so. As a rule, however, they can also mobilize, fundamentalize, ideologize, fanatize, and radicalize other unstable elements unscathed, just as Islamist preachers of hatred do. And one day, both through these Islamic freeloaders and through the sleepers themselves, the devil will go off in Europe, and the first terrorist act will take place, which will cost human lives. And when it comes to that for the first time, then this will be the beginning of subsequent similar events that will accumulate. And as I see the IS, it will not be long before his sleepers or individual terrorists fanatized and radicalized by hate preachers and IS propaganda will strike in various countries, whereby I think that in this relationship from all over the world, Europe will lead as victims of such IS sleepers or other murderous terrorists who want to live out their fundamental Islamic delusion and spread murder, manslaughter, destruction, and suffering. But it is estimated that practically the whole world will no longer be safe from such sleepers and other fanatical and radicalized terrorists, not only from those of the IS, but also from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist and anarchist and criminal groups.
That will actually be the case.
Have you made a foresight on this, or several of them?
Some things, well, yes, but basically the clear mind says what will result from the cause as effect. I have also made some probability calculations which have produced the same result as your statements.
Then I'm right.
No doubt about it.
So we can only wait and see what evils and catastrophes will happen because the rulers and authorities as well, as the secret services will not take action as it will be necessary because they are naive and incapable of recognizing reality and its truth. They are so blind, blue-eyed and convinced that they can keep everything under control and that they or their country will be spared, but with this stupid attitude, they cut themselves into their own flesh.
That will prove to be the case, and there is no doubt about it. But now, dear friend, I have to talk about something that we have already discussed several times, but which requires us to talk about it again.
I suppose you're bringing up the matter of...
Yes, that's the case. It is necessary that you still know some facts that result from, that I came across during my observations and investigations. It's about.
Unpleasant, then it is private, but I will make an effort and behave accordingly with what I now additionally know and speak with. A clear and open word.
You really don't have an easy task in this relationship, which has also occurred several other times in a similar or the same framework.
But this is the most difficult case, because there are a lot of things that have to be steered in the right direction.
Which is badly needed. Now, Edward, dear friend, I must go my ways again, and so I say goodbye to you. If you need me, then you can call me through Florina or Injana, because it is a great need for me to always be there for you when you need me.
Thanks, Ptah. Your presence always delights me very much and makes me happy, as well as your friendship. Goodbye, dear friend.